Hello, everyone. I am Eric Lufer, the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Citizens Research Council and BridgeDetroit's webinar on Proposal P in Detroit, the question of revising the city charter. If we can go one more slide. The Citizens Research Council is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is the Research Council's 105th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local government through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit organization, and we rely on the contributions of foundations, businesses, corporations, and individuals. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. If you value how this webinar and the associated paper contribute to public discourse and hope to keep the Citizens Research Council as an objective, independent, credible source of information into the next century, please consider a contribution. Next slide. Earlier this year, we launched what we call the Detroit Bureau, which is a return to our roots with a focus on the city of Detroit. This analysis of the proposed city charter is the first project out of the gate, and it will be presented today by our staff of the Detroit Bureau, Esmat Isag Osman. Esmat is the Research Council's expert on all policy matters related to Detroit affairs. He joined us earlier this year after completing his PhD in political science from Wayne State, and before that he got his BA from Michigan State. Next slide. We are co-hosting this webinar with BridgeDetroit. That is a nonprofit news and engagement organization that is laser focused on lifting up the issues that Detroiters themselves identify as important to their lives. BridgeDetroit is developing a community priorities model that will continually engage Detroiters to identify and prioritize the issues that challenge their understanding of and connection to vital civic information. BridgeDetroit produces journalism and community information directly responsive to its community priorities model, including engagement-focused journalism, high-impact project-based journalism, and direct response journalism. We'll have an opportunity for questions following Esmat's presentation. Orlando Bailey is joining us from BridgeDetroit to be the MC for this part of the webinar. Orlando is a lifelong Detroiter. He launched his professional career at Eastside Community Network, where he served as the Chief Development Officer. He's also co-host and producer of a podcast, Authentically Detroit, and is a host of an Urban Consulate, a space where people gather to have critical conversations about cities. If he joins us, I have not seen him log on yet. Here he is. Denzel McCampbell will be joining us at the tail end. Denzel was one of the charter commissioners, and we're going to give him an opportunity to weigh in on this. So if you do have any questions when we get to that part of it, please direct whether you want a response from Esmat or Denzel, or be direct if you can. So if we move on to the next slide. As I said, this is the first project for our Detroit Bureau. You can go to the web address you see here, crcmich.org/Detroit Bureau. We have our whole history going back 105 years of papers that we've put online, and there's plenty more that you can go through. All things related to Detroit City, Detroit Public Schools, what have you. You can find our analysis, our in-depth analysis of the proposal there. And if you want to be notified when new publications come up, on Detroit or some of the other things, you can text fax matter to 42828 and receive our regular emails letting you know what sort of analysis we've provided on our website. So with that, let me, I think, turn it over to Esmat, and we'll spend a little bit of time learning about his analysis of the proposed charter, and then we'll come turn it over to Orlando after that. Thank you all for joining us.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Eric, for that introduction. Thank you, BridgeDetroit, for partnering up with us to host this important event. Thank you, Orlando, for being here today, moderating with us, and thank you, Denzel, for joining us as well. So, as Eric mentioned, my name is Esmat Ishaq Osman, and I work in the Detroit Bureau. So let's just dive in. What is the proposed new Detroit City Charter? Well, Proposal P is the charter question for the proposed new Detroit City Charter, and it's seeking voter approval at the August 3rd primary election. It is the culmination of 3 years worth of work by the Detroit Charter Revision Commission, which convened in 2018. If Proposal P is adopted, the new charter would go into effect to create new departments and advisory commissions, shift the balance of power between the mayor's office and the legislative branch, and it would create new responsibilities for the city. If Proposal P is rejected, the current charter will remain in effect. The question of convening a new charter commission would automatically appear on the 2034 ballot, and residents and city leaders could still introduce amendments to address changes submitted in the proposed charter prior to that if necessary. So the fate of Proposal P could still change depending on how the Michigan Supreme Court rules on its qualifications for the ballot. Even though voters right now are presently voting on the charter question as we speak through absentee voter ballots, the fate of Proposal P could change depending on how the Michigan Supreme Court rules. This is a result of 2 lawsuits that were filed against the Detroit City Clerk as well as the Revision Commission, and not necessarily based on the provisions that are in the proposed charter, but more so because of a procedural question. An interpretation of the Home Rule Cities Act, which is a state law that provides municipalities with the ability to create their own charter and govern themselves. And so oral arguments were made before the High Court on July 7th, and we're still waiting on a decision to be made as to what their decision is. So what is a city charter? A charter can be thought of as the city's constitution. It is the public document that is created and adopted by the electors. And a city charter has 3 essential purposes. The first is to outline the elections process for city government. The second is to create the structure and the powers for providing city services, such as establishing the form of government, key departments, commissions, or boards. And thirdly, it is to provide enough structure to ensure efficiency in city operations. A city charter must be cautious as to not be too prescriptive, as to limit the ability of elected officials to respond to changing times. So broadly defined, a city charter defines the city government's organization, powers, and responsibilities. And even though the state allows cities to create their own charter and govern themselves, city charters must still operate within the legal framework that is established by federal and state law. And so just a brief history of the 2018 Charter Revision Commission. It was initiated in 2018 with little turnout, and they have been working on this for 3 years, which is the time that is allotted to Charter Revision Commissions to complete their duties. One of those years was met with a little bit of dysfunction as the Charter Commission was struggling to find their central mission, to find what are the proper procedural manner of going about convening meetings, and that really took away from some of the time that they had in order to draft a proposed charter. Past charters have usually utilized that first year to really start hashing out what their central mission is as a commission, start engaging with the community to start taking proposals for certain provisions. And so Even though with all of that being said, the Detroit Charter Revision Commission was still able to hold over 200 formal and informal community meetings and conversations. And this resulted in approximately 315 proposed revisions for the commission's consideration, addressing topics that are related to increased transparency, equity, representation, and citizen involvement in city government. And we have provided a timeline to the right of the slide that shows within their 3-year span, major milestones that Charter Revision hit during their time of completing their duties. And so the proposed changes in the charter can be broadly categorized as expansive and ambitious progressive policy reforms. Many of the provisions are emblematic of concerns of many Detroiters who feel neglected and forgotten in the recent resurgence of the city post-bankruptcy era. We see that through the redefinition of elected and appointed positions, the formation of structures and processes to ensure increased representation and equity for Detroit residents, and increased access to services, city services and programs, and as well as the inclusion of strategies to increase citizen involvement and government transparency through an equitable development framework. While this charter is driven by a focus on progressive governmental reforms, what we do see as we read through the charter is there is not the equal attention dedicated to provide for an efficient governmental structure and function. So one of the major changes in this proposed charter is a shift in power between the executive and legislative branches. This proposed charter does retain the strong mayor council form of government, which is a form of government that that Detroit has used since the early 1800s. It's very emblematic to that of the federal government, where we see the president acting as the leader of the executive branch and Congress being the legislative branch. In the same way here, the mayor is the leader of the executive branch, while city council functions as the legislative branch. So the proposed charter makes no specific changes to the authority of the executive branch to implement and manage programs within staff and operating departments. However, throughout various sections of the charter, we do see a diminishment of the mayor's appointment power with public boards and officers, as well as certain executive functions that the mayor has usually been responsible for. A primary example of that is that of advisory commissions. Advisory commissions are public bodies that are created and appointed usually by the mayor to assist with the implementation and development of programs and services within the executive branch. They assist certain departments in their development and implementation of the programs those departments are responsible for. And actually, language in the current and proposed charter grants the mayor full appointment authority for these commissions. You can find that in Article 7.103 of both the current and the proposed charter. However, in various sections of the proposed charter, the appointment authority for these advisory commissions is split jointly between the executive and the legislative branch. It's now the joint, these advisory commissions are now appointed jointly by the mayor and city council, which in fact conflicts with the language that is in the proposed charter itself. We also see this with the appointment of the chief of police. In the current charter, the chief of police is appointed by the mayor. And traditionally, within a strong mayor council form of government, that is also the case. But in the proposed charter, we see now that the chief of police is appointed by the mayor, city council, and the board of police commissioners. And another example of this diminishment of the mayor's power as it relates to certain executive functions is the proposing and development of a master plan for the city. In the current charter, the mayor is responsible for leading the effort to develop and propose a master plan for the city. Once the master plan is developed, the mayor proposes it to city council for city council's approval. Well, in the proposed charter, the mayor is removed from that process, and the responsibility of developing a master plan is now conferred to the hands of the Planning and Development Commission, which then proposes that city charter to, which then proposes that master plan to city council for city council's approval. The mayor at the very most may play an advisory role to that process, but nevertheless, the mayor is removed from that process of leading that effort to develop and propose that master plan, okay? So previous charters have maintained a separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branch, having the legislative branch serve as an oversight check and balance of the executive branch. Provisions that grant appointing authority elsewhere, such as the city council, can create conflicts in the process of governing and may prove to be counterproductive to the mission of running an efficient city government. Why? It is because lines get blurred. Lines of responsibility and lines of accountability become blurred, and that can create confusion in the separation of powers between both branches of government. Another major theme that we see in the proposed charter are attempts to increase transparency in city government. This proposed city charter has been referred to as the People's Charter by the public and by the commission as well. And transparency fits with the concept of a people's charter. It should be encouraged in every way. A lack of openness in government creates an environment where there is potential for the lack of accountability and the abuse of power. When any form of government is not forthcoming with information as to how it operates, it causes the public to be skeptical. And so I reference a couple of examples of provisions within the proposed charter that attempt to increase transparency in city government. We see that with the specific directives for the executive and legislative agencies or departments to provide reports or post city documents online or to public boards. We see that with the requirement for contractors that work with the city, contractor employee reports to be published with very detailed information on who these contractors are. We also see this with the requirement of the mayor to hold 2 community meetings in each district within a 7-month period, totaling out to 14 community meetings within a 7-month period with specific requirements as to what these community meetings should entail. We can think about these community meetings and their breadth and scope of what they should include as almost many state of the city addresses to each district, holding 2 community meetings to have that requirement settled. And so one of the challenges in making local government more transparent, though, is budget and resource capacity. Provisions that take transparency to the extreme can threaten to slow both branches of government to a crawl. And so we must ask ourselves, is this worth the cost of budget and human resources? As we think about these provisions and these attempts to increase transparency in city government, we have to balance out the trade-offs between increased transparency and what that would mean in terms of the cost it requires to execute. Another major theme in the proposed charter is that of increased citizen involvement in city government. We see this through the authorization of 47 new elected positions and the creation of 102 new appointed positions. And I'm sure some of you are looking at that 47 number and thinking, how is that even possible in terms of having that many new elected positions authorized with this proposed city charter? Well, a huge portion of that can be attributed to the community advisory councils. This is the third charter to propose community advisory councils, which have been difficult to implement in the past since their inception decades ago. The reason why these advisory councils have been difficult to implement is because of the lack of resources that have been put towards them. This proposed charter attempts to resolve that issue by compensating these advisory councils. And these advisory councils, if authorized, would be a 7-member public body in each council district. 5 out of those 7 members would be elected positions, while the other 2 would be selected by the elected officers, making up 35 of the 47 that you see here in terms of the authorization of 47 new elected positions. And the 102 new appointed positions are very much so attributed to many of the new advisory commissions that are proposed in the city charter. Also, the restructuring of how certain public officials are already selected within the current charter, and that of new task forces that are to be created through the legislative branch, as well as the Council of Arts and other public bodies that are proposed in this charter, okay? So it is important for Detroiters to understand the relationship to local government. and actively engage in that political process. Local government exercises power closest to the people. So increased citizen involvement in city government is important to the health of our government. It is also important to keep our public officials accountable to us and for the citizens to understand what exactly our public officials are doing in terms of the work they do for us. But the proposals in this document do raise important questions. One of which is, will the many commissions confuse the chain of command, lines of accountability, and decision-making authority? Will the lack of meaningful authority possessed by the commissions doom this model of increased citizen involvement? And what I mean by the lack of meaningful authority is that many of these commissions that are created are advisory commissions. So what that means is their function is that of an advisory role. They have no oversight function, which means that while it is important, the job that they do in advising the executive branch in its development and implementation of programs and services, they have no real power to ensure that what they advise gets done. And so with that little meaningful power and no compensation for commission members, will the roles of citizen input and advice be sufficient to attract citizens to commissions and sustain this model of increased citizen involvement? And lastly, a prominent theme in the proposed charter focuses on providing more government assistance to low-income and marginalized residents. Programs and provisions and policy ideas that are focused on increasing social justice and equity, okay? We see this through the public health focus that is now being initiated through the health department. The creation of a health and all policies task force, which would promote the health of citizens and eliminate racial and socioeconomic health disparities through public policy. This mandate is intended to function as a framework of guidelines using a health and all policies approach in equity practices. It would be applied in all cities' decision-making, policy development and implementation, budget priorities, delivery of services, partnership engagements, and every other facet of the city's operations. And if you would like to learn more about what a health and all policies approach to public policy is, we at Citizens Research Council of Michigan have published papers speaking to this. And so if you visit our website during your convenience, you can find more information on that, okay? You also see an increase in social justice or a focus on social justice and equity through the creation of new departments that are focused on providing assistance to vulnerable and marginalized residents, providing assistance to ensure that of environmental justice and sustainability in the city, and providing economic and consumer empowerment by focusing on small businesses and legacy businesses. We also see a focus on social justice and equity by the reimagining of policing, which alters the role of police. Several provisions in the proposed charter are intended to increase police accountability and address social justice issues related to the unfair treatment of Black and brown bodies by police officers, responding to the recent Black Lives Matter movement. So we see this through new police training guidelines and programs, the establishment of civilian rights in police provisions, the removal of qualified immunity provisions from police officer evaluations. We even see this through the reallocation of money that would usually go to the police department for services they provide to now be equitably funded towards social service programs, projects, and activities. We also see a new tax relief program as property taxes are a major problem in the city, and a new overassessment relief program to try and assist with the overassessment crisis that many residents faced and Detroiters faced last decade. Quick note on the new overassessment relief program. So this is an example of a provision within the charter that conflicts with state law. The state of Michigan has pretty significant central authority when it comes to tax laws that are able to be implemented on the state and local level. And so if the new overassessment relief program would not be able to be implemented in the way that it is written in the charter due to the conflict with state law that it provides. And so this is just an example that I wanted to point out of a provision that does happen to conflict with state law, and if passed, would not be able to be implemented in the way that it is written, and would most likely have to be decided in the courts as to how to move forward with that provision, okay? So all of these provisions and policy ideas are extremely important, and they're relevant to the time. They're issues that have been ignored and needed to be addressed for Detroiters to have a better quality of life. However, many of the provisions are overly prescriptive, and they can be pursued by other means of government action outside of the charter. Other states and cities across the nation are passing legislation pursuing initiatives for increased equity and social justice. Detroit can start to look to these cities and model programs out of it. Additionally, there are other avenues for action to be able to work towards implementing and making many of the proposals in the charter a reality. First is City Council creating ordinances or resolutions for programs and projects. An example of that is the reparations resolution, both resolutions actually that just passed in the recent weeks, to create a reparations task force and to bring the question to voters on the November ballot to make it a reality through ordinance. This resolution would create a reparations task force, much like the proposed charter, a provision in the proposed charter provides, which asks for a reparations task force, a permanent reparations task force to be created through the legislative branch. And it is just an example of how City Council can act to pursue many of these that are proposed in the new city charter, okay? We can develop public and private partnerships in the city to implement and fund programs. We see an example of that is the partnership that the city of Detroit and the Forward Motor Campus have established with one another over in Corktown. We can engage the city's broad nonprofit sector to assist with the provision and implementation of services and programs. During my time of working in nonprofits in the city, what I saw was that so many nonprofits in the city were working towards extremely important issues, but there was a lack of coordination and alignment in terms of the strategy that many of these nonprofits took to pursue certain broad problems that could more effectively be addressed if there was a little bit more coordination and alignment by all these wonderful nonprofits that do such important work. We can engage the vast number of foundations that work and serve the city on a variety of social justice and equity issues. And lastly, we can utilize state and federal resources and programs that are in discussion by the current administrations. And an example of that is that of the ARPA funding, which the city just voted to approve in terms of how to appropriate that money. Much of the plan that has been that was approved by the city includes appropriations towards programs or services that are also proposed in the new Detroit City Charter, okay? And so if Proposal P does not pass, or if it gets struck down by the court, the ideas in the proposals in Proposal P do not have to die with Proposal P. There are many avenues for action that we can engage with and that we can use to move forward. So the purpose of a charter is to give general authority and guidance on the operations and management of the city. One analogy that I like to use when thinking about a city charter is that of a US Constitution. Think about the US Constitution. The US Constitution is a document that provides a framework as to how our government should operate. It prescribes the rights and responsibilities that we have as citizens, as well as outlining the roles that many of the elected and public officials that we have in government should function. How weird would it be if our US Constitution had specific policy programs in that document, right? And so using that same kind of approach to think about a city charter is a good way to understand how government efficiency is affected if a city charter, which can be thought of as a city's constitution, has such prescriptive and specific directives as to how certain departments should function, how certain public officials should function, this, that, and the fourth, okay? Provisions that are overly prescriptive can restrict the city government's ability to adapt to changing times. It can bind and constrain the ability of public officials to be able to react to changing services and financial needs. governments require flexibility to adopt organizational structures that can maximize effective, efficient, and equitable performance in government. And lastly, I would like to make a note about the financial impact of this city charter. This proposed city charter does mandate new costs, some of which are relatively expensive. If you read through the proposed city charter, you will find that there's no specific language that provides alternative sources of revenue to fund many of these new programs or departments. And that can be problematic for the city, especially in the vulnerable or constrained position the city is financially. The incursion of new costs must come at the expense of resources that are used to fund existing costs or incurring budget deficits, especially if there is no language that provides for alternative methods of funding many of these programs and departments and services. It is important to also understand, excuse me, or remember that Detroit is still legally obligated to the 2014 plan of adjustment that came out of the bankruptcy. I've heard of narratives that talk about how the proposed city charter will bring us back into bankruptcy. I believe that is a little bit alarmist, but what I would say is that if without any alternative sources of revenue to be able to fund many of these new programs, services, and departments, it will be extremely difficult for the city to be able to maintain a balanced budget with the fiscal situation that it is in right now. And if the city does not maintain a balanced budget, it puts the city in a position to go back into state oversight if we don't receive a waiver from the Financial Review Commission. And so this is just something to keep in mind. And there have also been two narratives in terms of the financial impact of this proposed charter. The first is that from the city that projects that to implement this proposed charter would cost $500 million a year. I believe that that's more of a worst case scenario approach, where if in fact every single provision was implemented from this proposed charter, then in fact it may cost $500 million a year to implement it. And on the other side, the commission has stated that it would cost $7 million a year to implement keyword mandated provisions within the charter. And the reason why I highlight the word mandated is because there are many provisions in the charter that it is hard to put a price tag on, because ultimately it is going to be the role of city council to determine what kind of funding these departments or projects get and appropriate that money. So we believe that the financial impact of this charter lies somewhere in the middle between that $500 million mark and that $7 million mark. And so before voting on whether to revise the charter, voters should consider a few questions. Can this problem be addressed by a change in policy or the passage of an ordinance in city council? Should a solution to this problem be sought by putting new officials in office? Might state or federal legislation and programming address this problem more effectively? And can the change be made by charter amendment brought forth by city council as opposed to a charter revision? Or can the change be pursued by other means of governmental action? And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then that issue is probably not suited to be a provision that is included in the city charter, or is an issue that can be added to the charter by amendment rather than complete revision. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you, Azmat, for the presentation. I am also going to ask that Commissioner Denzel McCampbell be promoted to panelist for the Q&A portion of this event. Also, I am asking all 35 folks, there's Commissioner McCampbell. I'm asking all 35 folks in the webinar right now, if you have questions, to go ahead and put your questions in the question box, and you can direct your questions toward Azmat or Commissioner McCampbell, or to the both of them. Eric, if there are already questions in the question box, which I'm inclined to think that there is, I cannot see them. And so I would need some sort of special access to be able to see some of the questions, because I just believe that there already are questions here. Commissioner McCampbell, thank you so much for joining us. I'll get us started with, some of the questions that, are constantly being asked. We are witnessing, two information campaigns to, number one, encourage people to vote yes on Proposal P, and number two, to discourage people to vote yes on Proposal P. My question, and this is a nuanced question for the commissioner and for ASMAT, is this. The Michigan Supreme Court has not made a ruling on whether or not the revised charter proposal should even go on the ballot. We know that it is on the ballot. What happens should the Michigan Supreme Court rule in favor of keeping the charter on the ballot and making sure that those votes are counted, or the opposite? What happens? And do we know when the Michigan Supreme Court will come with a decision? That's for either of you.
I can start, and thank you to CRC, BridgeDetroit. Thank you to ASMAT for the very thorough analysis on the revised charter, and thanks for having me on this afternoon. Just to answer your question, Orlando, though, I'll answer the first part on what will happen if they rule away, right? It's my understanding is that if the Supreme Court rules that, this is an invalid question, or that it should not have been put on the ballot, it's my understanding that then that question will just not be counted as folks are voting on it. That's the way that they could rule it, right? On the opposite hand, if they rule that, the Home Rule Act was followed, and we were right to have it put on the ballot, then the question will be valid, and then it would just go to the vote of whatever the vote of the people is. It's not ideal. I don't think it's ideal for anyone, no matter what side you are on Proposal P. I think it's really confusing. We're in a confusing point for voters, right, that are being asked to vote on a question, to vote on a revised charter, when having the legal status of this question up in the air and the balance. It was my hope, since we had oral arguments on July 7th, that we would have heard back from the Supreme Court. We have not heard back. You could have a situation where maybe we hear back the end of the week before folks go to the polls, which will be something, or you could have a situation where we don't hear back until afterwards, right? And I think each of those aspects bring a bit of workaround that is needed, or education that's needed for voters. But that's my understanding. But if Asma has anything to add to that.
No, I think you answered it pretty fully. That is my understanding of the whole process as well. I think we're kind of in an unfortunate situation here, because however this plays out is confusing nonetheless. It would have been ideal to have had a decision handed down earlier in the process, especially before absentee voter ballots were mailed to voters, because in the situation that the charter question gets struck down from the ballot, that is just going to be a very tumultuous situation to try and explain and also to deal with. And so it's not an ideal situation, and it's the $1 million question in terms of when they are going to come down with a decision. My guess would have been sometime before August 3rd, just because that is when the election is. But hearing Commissioner McCampbell speak on it, I guess it's possible that it could come after. And I don't really know how that's dealt with if it does come after. And so, yeah.
How does a city charter interact with Michigan law, right? And so keeping my my ear to the ground and to the conversations that residents are having, I'm hearing folks say that it's illegal. The charter is illegal and it can't be implemented. Let's say the charter passes with voters and the Supreme Court affirms the decision to keep it on the ballot. If there are indeed illegal provisions in the proposed charter, what happens to those provisions? This is for either of you to take. And I'm getting some questions fed to me, and I'll get to those. Absolutely.
So I'll talk about how we came up with these revisions and how we ensure to make sure that this charter stays intact if these revisions are legally challenged, right? And I want to make it clear. I know there was some questions around the assessment program, and we tried. It's definitely true that under state law we can't give people back their money, right? We can't cut folks a check on over assessment. It was the will of the Charter Commission to try to at least do a tax credit. We thought that would be in line with the state law, but hearing ASMET as well is that may be challenged, and of course will have to be decided in the court. And that will be the aspect of every revision or every part of the charter itself, is that it can be challenged legally. But even if there was a provision that was ruled, in conflict with state law or not in conflict with the state constitution, there is a severability clause in the charter. So that section would just be invalid. The rest of the charter would stand, and that's how it would go through the process in that. But we did try as best as possible to be in line with state law, and in our purview and in the legal guidance that we got as well. The last thing I'll say is that I think what we see when you hear folks on the legality of the charter, I think the lines are being crossed in a way that they're hearing that the charter is held up in court, and then they're seeing about the various aspects in the charter. And what we've seen on this no campaign, what I'll just say is that we haven't seen substance around the actual provisions. We've just seen the one-liners on vote no is a problem and things like that. And I think that's what is confusing folks. But again, the legality of the challenges right now are around whether or not the question is valid to be put on a ballot, if that makes sense.
Yeah. ASMET, did you have anything to add before I get to the next question?
Sure. Just to give some context too, in terms of how the charter interacts with state law. So under state law, under the Home Rule Cities Act, and also under Dillon's Rule, which are all statutes and provisions that kind of dictate how cities are able to govern themselves. Ultimately, a city is a creature of the state. Nowhere in our Constitution has it even been conferred or specific to the fact that localities are an actual governmental entity. That is only provided if the state provides it. And so through the Home Rule Cities Act, the state does provide municipalities in the state of Michigan a lot of autonomy in terms of being able to govern itself, create this constitution to be able to set its own laws and organize its government, this, that, and the fourth. But ultimately, it all has to be in lockstep with the state, right? The state has ultimate authority as to say whether or not a municipality is able to do what it does. So just to provide a little bit of context there in terms of, we learn in federalism and in civics class, right, that we have federal government, state government, and local government. However, when we get technical with that, in our Constitution, we only see the federal and state government. And local governments are just creatures of the state that the state chooses to allow to be governmental entities.
Cool. ASMET, I think this is a question for you. Having read your report, please explain, lost it there. Having read your report, please explain what section of the proposed charter mandates free broadband I see that it mandates creation of a broadband commission, which will study pathways to free internet. Do you interpret this as being the same thing? Is that the interpretation?
So if you do read if you read the report, the language that we use to talk about that provision or that section in the charters does not say that the charter mandates free broadband. The charter mandates that a commission or a task force is created to encourage the city to develop access to free public broadband. And so the language is actually pretty specific in the charter and in the report itself as to the fact that we know the charter does not mandate that free broadband be created. It just mandates that this task force be created. And let me just be accurate in my usage of that. This commission, it is the Public Broadband and Technology Commission, that commission be created and that commission work with city government to encourage the creation of a program that would allow for free public broadband.
All right, the organizational chart includes many positions and organizational unit that are not defined by the existing charter. Instead of interpreting the positions defined in the new charter as an added cost burden, couldn't these positions be defined as a shift of responsibility? It's a pretty nuanced question. I like that question. Asmat, have at it.
Could you repeat that question again? So the question is, yeah.
Yeah, the org chart include, oh, people are still putting questions, so I lose my chart. Okay, my place. The organizational chart includes many positions and organizational units that are not defined by the existing charter. Instead of interpreting the positions defined in the new charter as an added cost burden, couldn't these positions be defined as a shift of responsibility or fiscal resources, I guess?
That's a great question, and that is a nuanced question. So you could look at it as a shift, but this proposed charter does not necessarily omit anything from the current charter. It adds provisions on, right? And why that is important is because anything that is included in a charter has special charter protection. So if you want to look at it from the perspective of you're shifting your interpretation of these new roles, you could look at it that way, but the reality is because many of the organizational chart that exists in the current charter still exists in the proposed charter, only new departments are added on, certain new officers are added on, new advisory commissions are added on. These become incurred costs because of the special charter protection that is placed for anything that is in the charter itself, right? So I think it would be the case in terms of what this question is asking. Aren't you just switching the role? Could you look at it as just switching the organizational chart to these new proposed offices or officers? That would be the case if certain organizational structures of the current charter were removed to then be substituted with what the proposed charter is providing for.
To tack on, go ahead, Commissioner, go for it.
What I'll also say is that thinking about the creation of this revised charter and the thought process around not only the commission but the residents who sent in revisions, what I'll say is that the overwhelming comments that we heard from folks is that they just did not feel that the current structure of the city government was responsive to the needs of residents, right? And what we attempted to do, and Asmat made a very good point around the nonprofits and folks in the city that try to supplement this work, but even the folks that, for example, if I use water affordability, even the folks that have been doing that work of trying to prevent water shutoffs, servicing families who have their water shut off, those groups even came to us to say, we're not getting the traction that we would have hoped to have with the city of Detroit to actually have a well-founded and well-thought-out solution to the issue of water affordability, which is why we took the action of changing the section around water affordability. So I just wanted to make that note as we, for example, and on that question, you know, we have district managers in the city, but district managers aren't laid out.
Is that in the charter?
That's not,
Is the org chart updated? Right. So we have an outdated org chart, right? Because all of these positions, like the district manager's position, other positions that have been created, every time a new position or department is created, does the org chart get updated within the charter?
not within the charter. I think that's laid out when we're talking about, you know, it could be through various ordinances or just the administration creating those new positions.
And just to piggyback on that, the mayor, the executive branch, has the power to create departments and prescribe for these departmental offices. The reason why you don't see that updated in the charter's organizational chart is because that's not protected by the charter. The only organizational offices that you see in, like, you know, through the charter are those that are explicitly mentioned in the charter, thus protected by the charter, and will always be there. And so the mayor having that ability to do that speaks to that flexibility that elected officials have to be able to create or disassemble an office or department based on changing financial or based on financial needs or whatever the case may be, right? So that is it's not that the org chart is not updated. It is just that the org chart that you see through the charter are those that are just protected and mentioned in the charter.
There's a question about, you know, this seesaw of narratives around the cost, right? And the city releasing a number and the Charter Review Commission releasing a number. I guess this question is for you, Commissioner McCampbell. Was the city involved in any meaningful way to debate the provisions and providing input throughout the charter revision process within the 3 years, 200 some odd meetings?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, this has been the biggest disappointing part, I would say, as we get to this aspect of hearing folks in opposition to Proposal P, and hearing and getting this estimate from the chief financial officers that we deeply disagree with. You know, throughout the 3 years, we sent letters to not only the administration, the city council, many of the subcommittee chairs, through our chairperson, sent letters to various department heads, and we did not get the interaction from those folks to come to the table to say, how are things working right now? What input do you have on the revisions that you want to see? And also, as we go through we sent multiple letters and multiple communications as we went through the revision process. You know, there are folks now that are in opposition that were on every one of those meetings and didn't say anything, right? And that as well, which has been incredibly disappointing. And then to see the cost provision come out from the CFO's office. And, you know, I think the CFO's office will say these are worst case scenarios, and Asmat alluded to that as well in the analysis. But what we also know is when we look at their numbers, for example, you know, there is a component in the charter, revised charter, that we lay out to say that the city shall work to increase youth employment opportunities in the city of Detroit. You know, really trying to amp up the already program, the Grow Detroit Youth program as well. But the CFO's office took that language and interpreted it as we wanted the city to employ every young person in the city. That was their worst case scenario, and that's not what we want, and that's not what is written there. So those are things that we saw and see in that fiscal analysis that we deeply disagree with. And as Asmat said, is that, you know, we do leave the leeway up to the city council and the mayor's administration to implement the proposals that we put into the charter. And there are some things that we are a bit more prescriptive of, but we try to ensure that the framework is there so that these issues are resolved. And there is the question, as Asmat said, is this appropriate for the charter? Can this be done through the city council or mayor? And again, as I said, we have residents that have been working on these issues from years and just have not had that interaction from the city council or mayor's office through multiple tenures, right? It's not just
about the nuance in that, Commissioner McCampbell, because I do believe that there's a nuance there, and I want to spend some time there. And we'll get to some more of the questions. We have a few minutes left, but Asmat, some of the recommendations toward the end of your presentation talked about alternative ways to get to the state of equity that the Charter Review Commission was trying to get to. And I guess my question, or maybe a little bit of pushback that I would give to that, is there have been folks in the streets, folks in every meeting, folks trying to influence the legislative body to legislate equity in the way that this charter is trying to, and have hit wall after wall, folks who are writing and proposing policy whose voice has not been heard, right, for years and years. And so did the CRC do any kind of analysis of grassroots organizations, community development organizations, and the work that they're doing to try to influence policy, the work that they are doing to try to legislate the kind of equity that the new charter review has been? Was there a consideration and even an acknowledgement of those attempts that haven't gone pretty far because of political will or whatever?
Yeah, so great question. So CRC has not yet done that sort of analysis. However, we did publish a blog post about 3 weeks ago that spoke to, for example, Mary Sheffield's and the rest of City Council's resolution to put together this reparations task force, which seems pretty significant. And I think it even speaks to this idea that many demands and many things that Detroiters have wanted to see get done are falling on deaf ears. I think that was a very great example of government, and even the elected officials, our city council, hearing those demands and putting forth some action to make sure that we are getting to that position. And a resolution was also just passed in terms of putting that question on the November ballot for Detroiters to vote on, to pass and create this task force so we can get to a position where we're passing ordinances towards more equity and social justice. What I would say is that in terms of the work that nonprofits and other foundations and organizations in the city, the work that they do, I can just speak from personal experience because I spent 7 years prior to coming to Citizens Research Council, working on the grassroots level and also working in the nonprofit sector. And the comment that I made in terms of needing to see coordination and alignment comes from that personal experience where, I worked at Citizen Detroit, which was a civic engagement nonprofit. And like I said, many of our peers or nonprofit organizations that we worked with or try to work with, we're all working on very, very important issues, but there just seemed to be a lack of coordination and alignment when trying to pursue certain broader issues in the city. More of a sporadic strategy in terms of where coordination and efforts are going. And so that's just from personal experience and talking about if we were to see more coordination and alignment in the kind of mission and work that many of these nonprofits do, we could see considerable progress in some of these important issues that we see, that we want to get done.
Thank you, Asmat. I see Eric has popped back on the screen, and it looks like we may be out of time. I also want to acknowledge folks who put questions in the question box that we didn't get to. Eric, is there a way for us to make sure that we get each person who posed a question, get those questions answered?
Yeah, the software provides all these questions, so we'll have them archived when we turn off the software. And our practice is to follow up with emails so those questions get answered. Um, we're going to post this on the website. I was going to say we could go a few more minutes if you want. I understand people have day jobs and maybe need to move on. We're going to post the recording, so it's up to you if you want to take a few more, or should we wrap it up?
I would love to take a few more if it's okay with Asmat and Commissioner McCampbell.
Why don't we go till 2:10?
All right. Commissioner McCampbell, is it clear? Oh, Commissioner McCampbell, is it clear which version is on the ballot? Which version of the charter review, charter revision is on the ballot?
Absolutely. So, and that's a great question. So before we wrapped up, I wanted to make sure that folks get the information. If you go to www.detroitcharter2018.com, you will be able to view the revised charter, also the revised charter with commentary, and also just the proposed revisions. And the version that is being placed on that is on the ballot and is the revised version of record is the version that was sent to the governor in February. I believe it was February 27th. And the reason why is that when we did go back to try to rectify some of the changes that the governor sent, but when we sent it back to the governor for review, she declined to review that version. So we, in accordance with the Home Rule City Act, that this version that's put on the ballot is the only one that was reviewed by the governor's office and the AG's office. So this is the one that is the revised charter of record. But again, www.detroitcharter2018.com, you will be able to see all of those correspondence and the revised charter.
This is another great question, especially as so many residents are dealing with flooding and infrastructure issues in light of these floods and storms that have ravaged the city of Detroit. Are GLEWA and DWSD, or I'm sorry, the Great Lakes Water Authority and the Detroit Water and Sewage Department regulated by our current charter? And are there any changes proposed?
So I'll just attempt that first. The charter does regulate the charter, the current charter, and the revised charter does have regulations of DWSD. The GLEWA is a separate, that is a regional entity that the city has entered an agreement with. So we don't necessarily have complete power of that. That is determined by the contract, and that's something that the governor's office has made sure we know as well. But I'll just add, just a little bit. I know we run out of time, but even on the flooding and the infrastructure issue, the departments, the new departments that were mentioned, I would say we do have currently a Department of Sustainability, but in the revised charter, we wanted to codify that department and strengthen it. So there's now the Department of Environmental Justice and Sustainability that's codified in the revised charter. And one of the things that this department will do is to work with other departments as well to make sure that we are building a sustainable infrastructure, that we are implementing green infrastructure and technology to be resilient to climate change and to take that action against climate change, but to also have residents at the table as we're talking about the Environmental Protection Commission, so that we can hear from folks in these impacted flooded areas, in these polluted areas in the city, so that the administration and city council has, again, that advisory and that input from residents on what we need to do to move forward. I just want to add that as we're talking about flooding.
All right, with 5 more minutes left, can the city council amend this charter as they see fit? Is the mayor incented to implement charter changes to protect his previous authority, Asmat or Commissioner McCampbell?
Yeah, so there are amendments that are able to be made to a charter. It cannot function as a wide swath revision of the charter, right? If amendments were made, they would have to be made to specific provisions or specific sections of the charter. In terms of the mayor conferring authority or power back to himself, I do not believe that that is something the mayor is able to do with the provisions that the charter provides in terms of the powers that he has. But there are amendments that can be made to the charter that can come about after the charter is passed and accepted by the voters.
It's important to know that those amendments have to be voted on by the people. The question is, can city council do this unilaterally? And the answer to that is no. They can come up with ideas and submit them to the voters, but it's a cumbersome process to amend the city charter.
Can I ask about, and there's a question in the chat, and maybe this is the last question. I'll add on. I'll read the question and then I'll add on to it. I'm wondering how it affect voter turnout in Detroit, which is already delicate. If the voters declare overall that they want to approve Proposal P, yet the Supreme Court essentially wipes away those votes. I want to talk about democracy, and I specifically want to talk about democracy in Detroit and how Detroiters for sure know how delicate democracy is, having it stripped from them in the wake of the bankruptcy and having to function under emergency management, under state provision. In these lawsuits that, that wanted to not even bring the charter revision to a vote. What do you say about the state of democracy when an elected commission does its job, regardless of how we feel about that job, and democracy is being challenged to the folks who elected these people to be able to even vote on it or have their vote counted on it? What is your answer to that? And that's the last question.
That's a good question. I could take a stab at it. I think we are in an unfortunate situation where I think all parties in this process were attempting to do their job, and it seemed as though that the time that was allotted for that job to be done properly was not there. Or was not enough for the job to be done in a succinct, efficient way, which then brought us to the situation where the optics don't look good, right? In terms of, this looks like voter suppression to a lot of Detroiters' eyes, in the sense of trying to understand, because really the issue here is an interpretation of the Home Rule Cities Act, right? Is government approval necessary for the charter question to be brought forth to voters for them to vote on? And you have two sides that are debating on the interpretation of this statute. And us at Citizens Research Council, we actually recognize that through the process of this happening, and we do want to kind of give a postmortem to the Home Rule Cities Act once all of this has died down and we kind of have a grasp of the situation, because it is unclear as to how that provision is supposed to be enacted. And it became a little trickier too with our Attorney General, informing the commission that approval was not necessary. And then others could argue, well, then why even go through that process, right? Why even then submit a charter to a governor for his or her approval? So I think the optics are just unfortunate here. And, in terms of Detroiters and the history we've had in the city of the lack of, or just the kind of things that we've had to deal with in the city, as it pertains to government and the lack of representation, this, that, and the fourth, I do think that the optics are bad, and I can't vouch for either side, really. What would you have to say on that, Commissioner McCampbell?
No, I think one thing to think about as we think about time is that this happened also through a pandemic that none of us thought was going to happen, right? And having to carry out this as well. What I'll say is that I think the optics are very bad for this. We had Justice Bernstein during the Supreme Court hearing asked the lawyers, the counsel of the folks who were suing to not have a place on the ballot, how does it look that a state is telling the people of a city that you can't be the deciders of your charter, right? And I think that's what, as you alluded to, as both of you alluded to, is that what Detroiters are seeing is that we can't even decide. We can't have a summer of debate on if these issues are appropriate for the charter, on whether or not we're going to vote yes on it, because it is tied up in the court. And you had a commission that was you had a question that was voted on, and I agree that it was very low turnout. That's a separate conversation that we have to talk about. But you had the question that was voted to be open to revise. You had a commission that was voted on by the people. You had residents of the city of Detroit interacting with this commission throughout the process, and you had a commission vote to put forth this revised charter. There does have to be clarity put forth by the Homewood City Act to be clarified on why it's there and how it's laid out. But in this moment, as you alluded to, Orlando, when we're talking about emergency management, when we talk about, even having the state have to step in with our elections last year, I think Detroiters are very concerned that there's a constant pattern of the state saying you can or cannot do something, even though we are creatures of the state, but in a way that's using, and it's been unfortunate that these lawsuits have come from Detroit residents, right? So I think that's another aspect of that as well that we're seeing also.
Thank you, Commissioner McCampbell.
Could I add just one more thing for listeners to go away with? One thing that, at least in my opinion, that I would hate to happen, right, is that this proposed charter passes, Detroiters become very hopeful about the provisions that have passed and the fact that these are their ideas in our city's constitution, and we're going to see some change happen. And then there's a lot of litigation that comes about from this, or we're not able to balance the budget in the way we need to, as is required by our plan of adjustment. We're not able to get our waiver from the Financial Review Commission, and there's the ability for us to go back into state oversight and have emergency management come back. I would hate for Detroiters to kind of feel again like they're stripped away, like what they worked on so hard in terms of getting this proposed charter passed is once again stripped away from them. So that is just a thought that I've been thinking about, right? That is a situation that I would hate to happen, where we pass this charter, there's jubilation and hope in terms of, oh, we're going to get so many of these things done. A lot of these provisions are not able to be implemented in the way that is thought that they should, because they just conflict with state law, or there's not enough budgeting for it. And then yet again, there's disappointment in terms of what government is able to do for Detroiters. So
many questions, so many places I can go with that, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Esmat and Commissioner Campbell, thank you so much. Eric?
Yeah, we're going to make that the last word. So Orlando and everyone at BridgeDetroit, thank you for partnering with us on this. Commissioner McCampbell, thank you for taking the time to be part of our webinar. Esmat, good job bringing all this forward. As I said, all this has been recorded. It will be on the website. Feel free to share. It takes about an hour for YouTube to process everything and put it up. But before the close of business today, it'll be on our website, crcmich.org. And we're going to take all of the questions and provide a written answer to them, either capturing what's been said during the webinar, or providing a scripted answer. So all of you will get your questions answered if it wasn't done today. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day. It looks like we have some nice weather before rain tomorrow, so get out and enjoy.
thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.